The Workers' Institute was actually built for women, the women chain makers from Cradley Heath. Most Workers' Institutes in the past tended to be built for men. Chain making was a huge industry in Cradley Heath. Men tended to work in the factories, making the heavier chain for the ship's anchors, and the women tended to work in little workshops in their backyard, where they'd work for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, making on average 5,000 links of chain per woman per week. The average amount of pay was between 5 or 6 shillings a week. They'd start the week with the long rods of iron, which were provided by a person called a fogger, usually male, but they could also be female, who was the middleman between their employers and themselves. And they'd be provided with the iron, which they'd then spend the week hammering into chain links. A lot of the women's chain was used for agricultural use, military use, whereas, I say, the men tended to make the chain for ships' anchors, like the Titanic anchor, which was made by Noah Hingleys in Netherton. It was not uncommon for women to have their preschool children in the workshop with them. There are many accounts of women going home, having worked a whole day in the chain shop, having a baby and being back at work the next day. Babies were often put in a box on top of the bellows so that as their mother was getting air into the fire, she could rock them to sleep, or they may be strung from chains on the ceiling, sort of hanging down so they could be swung to sleep. And it does make you wonder how they managed to keep the children quiet for 12 hours a day whilst they were working. Older children, when they returned home from school, would be expected to help their mothers in the chain shop, with the idea being that they'd learn the skills they'd need for the moment they left school and could join the chain making trade. It was a very hard life. They say the women chain makers lived hand to mouth, that they didn't need a larder because they were constantly earning money to buy food for their families. In 1906, there was a sweated trades exhibition in London, where a lot of men and women from sweated industries were put on display, and this caused the government to take some notice of the conditions that these people were working in. And in 1910, a petition by the government was set up to introduce a minimum wage of twopence halfpenny an hour for the women, which, although it doesn't look a huge amount of money, would have taken them from around about 5 to 10 shillings a week, so could have doubled their wages. Unfortunately, a lot of the bosses of the smaller companies that they worked for were not so keen on the idea. The larger companies apparently paid it straight away, but a lot of the smaller companies drew up an agreement that they got the women to sign, which basically tricked them out of their pay rise. It said on the form that they were going to have the pay rise in 6 to 12 months' time. Obviously, the idea was never to give them the pay rise. So in 1910, Mary MacArthur, who had been involved in the 1906 exhibition, came to Cradley Heath to try to persuade the women to strike. Mary MacArthur was from Scotland originally. Her parents were from a fairly upper middle class background, and Mary had worked for her father in his drapery business, and she asked if she could work in the offices doing the accounts for the business and paying his workers their wages. She enjoyed writing articles for the local newspaper, so her father sent her along to a shop workers' union meeting with the idea that she'd write an article for the paper persuading his staff not to join the union and kind of taking fun out of it. But unfortunately, when she got to the meeting, she saw a lot of her father's staff there, heard what the people had to say, and persuaded the staff to join. This was the start of Mary's interest in politics. So after the strike, Mary went on to achieve many things. She looked after a lot of women in the munitions factories during World War I and travelled around many factories, checking that they had simple things like toilets and somewhere to eat. And in 1918, she was one of the first women to stand for Parliament. She stood for Stourbridge, but was unsuccessful in getting voted into Parliament. We think for a number of reasons, possibly because her and her husband were involved in the peace negotiations before the First World War, so people possibly considered her to be a pacifist. And also because when she stood for Parliament, everyone in the Black Country knew her as Mary MacArthur. She'd been married at that point, so she had to stand under her married name, and we think that possibly confused a few people and maybe lost her the vote. In this picture here, we also have Julia Varley, who was quite instrumental in the strike. She worked for Cadbury's in Birmingham and was a friend of Mary's and encouraged her to come up to Cradley Heath to talk to the women during the before they went on the train strike. One of the interesting stories to come out at the end of the strike was the very lovely Patience Round, 79-year-old lady from the strike, made it to 103. And this is a lovely photograph of her celebrating her 100th birthday. She was given a cake and driven around the town, possibly by the mayor, too sure, to celebrate on the day. Mary had around about £2,000 of the strike fund left, and rather than put it back into the National Federation of Women Workers, she decided to build a tribute to the women. This is the building that we're now standing in. Albert Thomas Butler made the design, and the building was built between 1910 and 1912 and opened in 1912. But unfortunately, when it was opened to begin with, they hadn't raised enough money to pay for the furniture. So they had many bazaars where there's talk of the women chainmakers rubbing shoulders with the slightly more well-to-do ladies who were buying items to raise money to furnish the buildings. The building had a lot of uses. It could be used for lectures in an evening by the Workers' Education Authority so that the women could learn extra skills that they may not have had in their schooling. The front office downstairs was used as a union office. Women could come in and pay into the union each week. And the one amazing thing that Mary actually set up was a doctors, dentists and maternity fund. So the women were now earning more money. They could afford to pay in and save up in case they ever needed glasses, needed help with a midwife when they're having a baby and so forth. Mary decided to speak to the employers and hold lots of meetings with them to try and negotiate bringing in the twopence halfpenny an hour minimum wage pay rise. Lots of meetings were held, and eventually by middle of October, many of the companies had signed what was called the white list, which was an agreement that all the employers made to pay the new rise to the women. The strike ended on the 22nd of October 1910, with all the women successfully getting their pay rise and hopefully going back to work on slightly more money than they were earning before. She came to Cradley Heath, and there are lots of lovely photographs of her stood on the back of a horse and cart, talking to the crowds, trying to persuade the women to strike. The only problem was that the women were a little concerned about how they'd feed their families, that the children would starve if they went out on strike, and the fact that they might lose their jobs. So Mary decided to have a huge publicity campaign. And to do this, she used photography in the newspapers, pictures of the women in their Sunday best hats with their chains around their necks, placards in front of them. She also got in touch with Pathé News, which hadn't been running long by that point, to come and film the women's work conditions. Her idea worked very well because pictures appeared in papers all over the world and money started to flood in for a fund. There was money from the Countess of Warwick, the Earls of Dudley. The Cadbury family supported the strike each week by sending money, and simple things like pennies and halfpennies from other working communities. People sending jewellery that could be sold. People sent food for some of the women, and £4,000 were raised from the publicity. With this, Mary was able to pay the women while they were out on strike, and each week they were paid money to each woman. Apparently the ladies with babies, we usually give them the money first, so there is a humorous story. How true it is, I don't know, but that the women would pass the baby down the line, so different women kept appearing with the same child to collect the money. And they were out on strike for quite some time. They went on lots of marches around different areas, getting publicity, raising funds. They went on trips to Cadbury's. One of the ladies who appears in a lot of the publicity is 79-year-old Patience Round. She was the oldest striker at the time, still working full-time, and her children and her children's children are described as being slaves of the forge. And she very much enjoyed the trip that they went on to Cadbury's because she came back with a nice red rose and a shiny apple. Mary decided to speak to the employers and hold lots of meetings with them to try and negotiate bringing in the twopence halfpenny an hour minimum wage pay rise. Lots of meetings were held, and eventually by middle of October, many of the companies had signed what was called the white list, which was an agreement that all the employers made to pay the new rise to the women. The strike ended on the 22nd of October 1910, with all the women successfully getting their pay rise and hopefully going back to work on slightly more money than they were earning before. For all that Mary did for the women, sadly her own personal life was rather sad. Will Anderson, her husband, was constantly asking to marry her, and she kept putting him off because I think she kind of wanted a career. They did eventually marry. They had a daughter, and sadly Will died in the Spanish flu epidemic following the First World War, and Mary died of stomach cancer in 1921. So sadly didn't live to do all I think she would have done had she lived a bit longer. I think she'd have probably eventually got into Parliament eventually. But a very interesting character, one who's not very often talked about in schools. Thank you for joining the tour.